You're watching 12 WKRC TV, a new generation of news. This is 12 Newsmakers.
Good morning and welcome to Newsmakers. The Covington Human Rights Commission has proposed an expansion of the city's Human Rights Ordinance, which was first adopted in 1998. The current ordinance focuses on discrimination in the areas of housing, employment, and public accommodations based on race, religion, gender, age, and physical or mental disabilities. The proposed legislation would expand the scope of the ordinance to include sexual orientation, gender identity, family, marital, and/or parental status, and place of birth. The proposed law would also require any complaints made to the city to be referred directly to the Covington Human Rights Commission rather than the city manager as under the current statute. Finally, the proposal seeks to provide the Commission with some enforcement powers which it now lacks. The 5-member Human Rights Commission proposed the legislation 10 days ago. The City Commission has scheduled a hearing for the proposal on February the 11th at City Hall. To discuss the proposal in Covington, I am joined by the Reverend Don Smith, the chair of the Covington Civil Rights Commission and the pastor of the Community of Faith Presbyterian Church, and David Miller, the vice president of Citizens for Community Values, a grassroots citizens organization known for its efforts in fighting pornography and its support of what is known as Article 12 of the Cincinnati City Charter that bans any legislation protecting gays or homosexuals. Welcome to Newsmakers.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I tried to lay out the basic structure of this proposed piece, and I want to get a few things clarified right at the beginning. On the question of protection for place of birth, what's that a reference to?
Well, let me put it this way. The last place I lived was a rural area in Michigan, and people discriminated up there against Appalachians, people from southeastern Kentucky, western part of Virginia. And I was surprised to see that because I'd never heard that before. But it was quite pronounced. And so I think what we're trying to do in place of birth is to provide, to make sure that such people have the same rights and considerations as others.
And of course, Appalachian migrants, urban Appalachians, would be a significant group in Covington.
Yes, that's true.
At least historically,
yes,
the question of identity. Does it also refer to foreign immigrants as sort of a recognition of the post 9/11 consciousness?
Yes.
Okay, so secondly, just to set this up, some people have said, and sometimes referred to in the newspapers this way, as a gay rights protection legislation. Mm-hmm. Is that what this is in your mind?
No, not at all. In the first place, we don't see it as a gay rights piece of legislation at all. We see it as a human rights thing. Now that may sound like a semantic exercise to some people, because one of the predominant differences between the existing ordinance and the new ordinance obviously is sexual orientation and gender identity. But the fact of the matter is we're trying to make it so that everybody in Covington who obeys the law, pays taxes, crosses at the corner, salutes the flag, does all that stuff, will not be discriminated against in any way. And that would include housing, public accommodation, and employment. The existing ordinance only provides for that in housing.
Okay, the existing ordinance only talks about housing. You're trying to expand to employment and public accommodation.
Correct.
Okay. David, with that backdrop now, what is CCV's view of this proposed legislation?
Well, we look at it first is that before the government passes civil rights laws and infringes on somebody's civil rights, somebody else's rights, like the right to own private property, there must exist a widespread problem in order to justify the actions of the government, because they are going to come in and they pass these civil rights laws to right a wrong. And the fact is there is no widespread, institutionalized, systematic discrimination that is taking place, certainly against people who identify themselves as homosexuals. And we would say that this kind of law, when you include items such as sexual orientation that recognizes somebody's personal, private sexual behavior, we are abandoning those criteria that the courts have used in Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has said in civil rights laws.
If this law didn't include the question of sexual orientation and gender identity, but included place of birth, for example, and also expanded the purview from just residential questions to employment, took out that, would you still be opposed?
No, I don't think we would. And again,
so the issue for you is really the gay rights and sexual identity questions.
It is, because everywhere these laws have been passed, they've been used not to right a wrong, but to punish people who disagree with homosexuality. That's where it's been used. And I can cite case after case, the Boy Scouts being the worst the whipping boy that's been used over and over again.
Don, have there been incidents in Covington of discrimination, actions against gays? Is this in response to a real issue, a real problem?
Well, I have to tell you that when this was first proposed in our commission, it was not. All we were trying to do was establish a, if you'll pardon the expression, a level playing field for everybody in Covington. But once it became known that we were doing this, several people, most notably from the gay community, came and began to give us a lot of anecdotal information. I dare say that with all the information that you could put on the table, we could put the same amount of information on the table, because every person we've talked to has a story to tell about discrimination.
I think those stories would be on the table if they existed.
Well, some of those stories have been reported. I mean, there is a report in the newspapers, a report of people when it comes to renting apartment. I read a story about someone who was employed in Covington as an organist at a church. I read a story of a woman, a story of a woman who talked about how she was treated inside a business, and was told that because she was out as a gay person, that she had no future in the business. So I mean, some of those stories have been out.
These are, and again, they are few and far between. They're very anecdotal, and civil rights laws need widespread abuse before the government can be justified in coming in and infringing on somebody else's private rights.
How do you see this proposed legislation possibly infringing on somebody else's rights? Would this, for example, what would this do to a person who owned say a two-family house or a small apartment building that they themselves lived in, maybe a 4-unit apartment building, and they lived in one of the apartments? How would that affect their ability to make judgments about who they wanted to rent to?
There wouldn't be a problem. They would be able to make that judgment for a 4-unit or smaller dwelling place, according to our ordinance. We would not force somebody, for example, to rent to someone who they disapproved of, regardless of what category it was.
No matter what the reason is.
Yeah, if they lived in a duplex or a 3 or 4 unit apartment.
Why
I'm
does
embarrassed
size
to say
make
too
a
that
difference?
I'm also embarrassed to say that we have a religious qualification as well, where churches have to have the ability and the authority to deny whomever they choose if they deem the person to be against the tenets of their religion.
So there are exceptions here.
Yes, there are.
Now, you asked a question, David. Why small units being exempted here?
If civil rights are good for everybody, they should be allowed for the whole community. And so even in Covington, here we've said, well, if you're a certain size, then we'll exempt you. If you're a religious institution, we'll exempt you. If it's wrong to force a church to hire a homosexual, then why is it wrong to force a Christian landlord?
Don?
Well, I'm trying to think of how to frame this answer. I mean, obviously we're in diametrical opposition here.
Well, and I think the principle of fairness is what we need to get to. And
that's what I was going to say. The principle of fairness is exactly what we're talking about. But unfortunately and historically, going back for centuries, this particular community has been discriminated against, and there's all kinds of historical documentation to prove that. When Hitler, began rounding up Jews, he also rounded up communists and gay and lesbian people and put them into concentration camps. I'm very concerned about
that. Many years ago, it doesn't exist today. That's not what America's about.
Are you saying that there is no discrimination against gays and lesbians in this society?
I'm not saying that there is no discrimination. What I'm saying is there isn't widespread discrimination, and secondly, where these discrimination laws are instituted, they're only used to punish people who disagree with this issue.
Do similar laws as the one that you're proposing, do similar laws exist in other cities in Kentucky?
Yes, they do. They exist right now in Louisville and Jefferson County. They exist in the Fayette County, Lexington regional government. And basically what we're trying to do is, one of the things that we're trying to do is to bring Covington into this so that we can be the third city that grants equal rights to all of its citizens. And that, again, is the point. Some people have rights and other people don't, and it just seems to me that that's wrong, and we need to make sure that everybody has the same opportunities.
Let's think about being a landlord. If I'm a landlord and I want to rent to someone, if I go out and look in their car and it's a pig pen, they're probably going to do the same thing to my house or my apartment, would they not? And I have the right, as a landlord, as a property owner, or even as an employer, I have the right in America to make a decision based on that person's personal character or his personal behavior.
All these arguments we've been hearing for generations. I mean, I don't think there's anything new that you're bringing us, David, because my concern is that let me finish.
Okay.
We had the same opportunity. We had heard the same thing 40 years ago with the African American community. We heard 20 years ago, we heard the same thing with the women, the feminist
And we
community.
righted those, did we not?
It depends on who you talk to.
No. Well, as a society, we righted those through constitutional amendments. And what's happening is this
but
really
then why not then right this historic wrong and a historic pattern on this other area?
Great question, because the way we fixed it was the right way, not through circumventing through these city ordinances that are used to punish
Well, how did
people.
how did we right
We
the
went
other
through we went through Congress. We had a significant majority of people who supported this. They sent it to the states and they passed the constitutional amendment. That's why it was fixed.
Well, there's lots of local legislation that deals with civil rights.
That's
it's
right.
not just on the federal level.
But
the
they
civil
don't.
rights movement was not just a national movement. It was a local, city by city, community by community struggle to get laws changed all over the South, all over the North.
But
right?
those laws are in
It's
sync.
not a minority thing, and it's not a women's thing. It's an everybody thing, and that's all I'm saying.
But what we're doing is identifying somebody's private sexual behavior, and we're trying to give special protection based on that.
I have less than a minute left. If this wasn't passed, if we just continued with what we have right now, if a person had a problem, a gay or a homosexual had a problem, can current Kentucky and federal law satisfy a complaint?
No.
And the Covington ought to fix that. They ought to be able to have the proper means to make a complaint.
And very quickly, what's the proper means?
To have somebody that can hear that complaint. But it's not based on somebody's private sexual behavior.
But
That's where we're
doesn't
missing.
the law need to be changed?
Not to protect that. It's used to punish people.
We're almost out.
Yeah, we're just getting to it, We're just getting to the crux of it. And the problem, again, is we're not talking about private sexual behavior. We're talking about discrimination.
Okay. The meeting is February the 11th at City Hall in Covington on Madison at Pike, so people can attend and have their voices heard. Thank you for being here. We are just getting to this, but thank you. Stay tuned. After the break, a new book that explores the role the people of one Ohio river town played in pushing forward the promise of the American Revolution in the face of America's original sin, slavery. Welcome back. Over the past 9 years, the effort to develop the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati has stimulated a great deal of attention for the fight against slavery between 1820 and 1865. That struggle was carried out in towns and villages across North America, and no place was more important than tiny Ripley, Ohio, 50 miles upriver. This book, Beyond the River, The Untold Story of the Heroes of the Underground Railroad, which was released this weekend, explores that story. The author, Ann Hagedorn, has written for newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal, taught journalism at Northwestern University, and published 2 earlier books. Last Monday, I talked at length with Ann Hagedorn about her new book and began by asking why someone who had concentrated on business reporting chose the history of the Underground Railroad to write about at this point in her career.
And for years, my whole career was consumed with writing about white-collar criminals. I was a cop reporter in my early years and evolved into a fraud specialist. And everyone I was writing about for years and years did the wrong thing. And so I think that when I came upon this story of a group of people who devoted their lives to something larger than themselves, who took risks, you know, on a weekly basis at least, and had a lifestyle that was basically devoted to something that they truly believed in and that they knew was right, and yet their culture was actually telling them they were wrong, that slavery was right. They believed that slavery was wrong. They had the courage to stand up and say no to it. That utterly fascinated me from the very beginning.
Ann, how would you characterize Ripley, especially in the, say, decade right before the Civil War?
I call this period that the Underground Railroad was operating in along the Ohio River the war before the war, because basically there was a battle against slavery going on here that had started, you know, before the 1820s even. And by the 1850s, it was very intense. And I firmly believe this, that slavery would not have ended, that the anti-slavery movement would not have gotten to the point of strength that it did without the foundation of a really strong movement right here. And when you think about it, you have to remember that these people, this is the front line. These people who lived on Front Street and in this town were on the front line of the battle. You know, almost every day there could have been some sort of incident or some sort of confrontation having to do with slavery. And so to be against it in this town was one of the strongest and most important contributions that an individual could make in that period of time toward ending slavery.
One of Hagedorn's goals is to challenge some of the myths that have grown up around the story of the Underground Railroad.
One of my quests in writing the book was to expand the concept of the Underground Railroad beyond the image of a white movement. You know, it was clearly not, and one of my greatest discoveries in the research of this book were many more free blacks involved in it. In fact, one of them, John Hudson, was proclaimed by some in letters and diaries as being the boldest participant on the Underground Railroad. He's a new name. There were many free blacks, women, teenagers. You know, there was a whole array of people working on the Underground Railroad here.
One of the people who doesn't fit into that traditional white savior myth is John Parker. And of course, we're standing in the restored home of John Parker here on Front Street in Ripley. What role did he play? And then also, how did you evaluate Parker's story and the authenticity of a story like Parker's?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges in researching the Underground Railroad. There's a lot that's mythological. There's a lot that's exaggerated after the war is over. You know, there are people who said they were participants who might not have been. And there are people telling stories that may or may not have happened. When I was doing my research, what I tried to do when I found an original account like Parker's, I tried then to verify the details in it through events that happened at the time, everything from weather to events to newspaper articles to other letters and diaries, any sort of, or court records, any sort of documents that I could use to verify what they were saying. And there were things that I didn't include in the book because I couldn't verify them. Wonderful stories, but I felt that they weren't verifiable. The John Parker story is not, this is not a man bragging. You know, it's not a man making things up. It's very clear. And there are verifiable things in that book. And so, and there are things that he says that match up with letters, diaries that other people have said.
Hagedorn also challenges the simplistic views about whites who claim to be anti-slavery.
Within the context of anti-slavery advocates, you had layers. You know, you had people who would give lip service to hating slavery, but not participate in the Underground Railroad, because participating in the Underground Railroad was breaking the law. And so you had people who would participate in the Underground Railroad, but were still baffled about what do we do when slavery ends. And were not for equality, and were filled with prejudice. And so they didn't always come through. And then you had the people on what I call the higher ground, which John Rankin, John Parker, John Mahan, John Hudson, I guess you had to be named John to be an abolitionist, but who believed fully in equality. And so they were not only working to end slavery, they also were running schools to educate free blacks, to bring slaves over to educate, because they fully believed in equality of the races.
It's a lot of people you discuss in your book and the roles that they played, but obviously the role of the Reverend John Rankin stands out above everybody else. What is it that puts him so far out ahead?
You have to really put John Rankin in the context of his period, I think, because, and that's one of the great lessons we can learn from this story. This was a guy who didn't go to one rally for his cause some Friday night. This was someone who, for more than 40 years, believed in something so strongly that he stuck with it and had no idea what the outcome would be. You know, we're so goal-oriented in this culture, and these people, many of them died before they even saw slaves freed. And John Rankin, none of these people knew whether or not what they were doing, you know, what they were working towards would be accomplished. And yet he continued in the cause year after year after year after year. And there were some very tough years for abolitionists.
And Rankin's letters on slavery are incredibly insightful. Do you have a favorite passage?
He gets to a very deep psychological and philosophical level, which a lot of the rantings and ravings against slavery at the time didn't. So one of my favorite passages is the one where he talks about the basis of slavery. At the basis of slavery is racial prejudice, but at the basis of that, he wrote, is the love of gain, which is, he wrote, the polluted fountain whence issue all the dreadful ills that pervade our world. It gives energy to the tyrant's sword, it drenches the earth with blood, and it binds whole nations in chains. The love of gain first introduced slavery into the world and has been its constant support in every age. We often see the love of gain weighing down the finest feelings of soul, blunting the most acute powers of perception, crushing the strongest faculty of judgment, breaking the most powerful ties of humanity. I mean, it's powerful writing when you say.
As a writer, as a researcher, as a historian, what is it that you hope this book does for your readers? What is it that you hope readers do with this book?
I hope that this book takes the story of the Underground Railroad beyond the tunnels and secret rooms to the human values of the participants. These are great Americans in the Underground Railroad, consisted of great Americans who at the time were considered un-American because they were saying no to something that was very American, which was slavery. And so this is a great lesson for us all in terms of becoming individuals and in terms of being great Americans.
Thank you very much. We'll be interested in seeing what the reaction is to your book. If you would like to meet Ann Hagedorn, she will do readings this afternoon, Sunday, at 1 p.m. at First Presbyterian Church on Mulberry Street in Ripley. And then from 2:30 to 6 this afternoon, she will be signing books at the Ripley Library and talking to people. Thank you for making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. We leave you this morning with some views of historic Ripley on a very cold, clear winter day.